Is it going to be necessary? Is that going to be a thing?
Just for today.
That's pretty though. Oh my gosh. And they get to see your cool outfit and everything and the friggin' duck on there?
Yeah, there's another one too. This is what happens when I ask my husband, who knows how to felt, to patch me sweaters.
Oh,
Good for him. Right, makes little,
oh my god.
little ducklings. Right? Get you a man who, etc., etc.
Honestly.
So Pervina Luna. I wanna start by talking a little bit about Russia in the 90s. God bless. Because we have, of course, spent the last, who knows how long at this point, talking about how much the Soviets sucked, right? You know, we beat up on the capitalists for a while, and then we talked about what rat bastards the Soviets were. Which kind of leaves us in a strange position vis-a-vis freedom coming to the Soviet Union in the form of capitalism, right? As I said, you know, Glasnost begins with Gorbachev in 1986 and his hope to liberalize the country's economy and to free up, to at least some degree, Soviet repression in terms of media and the arts and so forth. But of course, this is perilous as an example, and something that, you know, if the class was longer or sort of a different theme, I could have showed you to contrast Pervina Luna. One of the first free movies made during Glasnost that really hits hard is a documentary by Marina Godolskaya called Solovki Power. And Solovki was the first gulag in the USSR. It was north of St. Petersburg. The labor project was the White Sea Baltic Canal. It was begun in 1928. And it was, you know, a classic documentary as we would think of one, right? She goes up there and she goes through reports and she sort of details the brutality for years that happened during this project of building a canal with prison labor. And of course, in talking about prison labor, we're talking not just about what we would think of perhaps as criminals, but also political prisoners who are treated much worse than just regular everyday criminals in the Soviet Union. And this came out, it was all over in theaters. People found out for the first time that their family members had been in the camp as prisoners, because if you didn't die and if you were released, it was considered sort of shameful, right? So you didn't tell your family, or more acutely, people who realized for the first time that their family members, their fathers and grandfathers, had worked as guards in this camp, had tortured and mutilated and murdered people. Because one of the things Godovskaya does is find some of the people that did this. You know, living today in St. Petersburg or Moscow or wherever. And this is part of the documentary. You can probably imagine what the airing of these things does in terms of the unity of the country, right? You know, first of all, starting in 1988, you have all of the Soviet republics trying to break away, who never really wanted to be part of the USSR in the first place, or fundamentally part of, you know, a colonial or imperial project on the part of Russia. To Gorbachev's credit, rather than kill 100 million people, we just sort of lets them go, right? But you know, just even within, you know, Russia itself, even within the imperial core, these sorts of liberalizations just lead to the outing and realization, right, of the crimes of the Soviet past, which many people who were young in the 1980s did not fully know about, right? I mean, it's a controlled view. We've seen how history is tampered with, right? And of course, if you couple that up with what we know about, pre-Glasnost 1980s consumer shortages and economic stagnation and corruption and blah, 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 and Gorbachev's government shot themselves in the foot with Chernobyl. He had come to power promising a more open government. They have a catastrophe, right? A nuclear catastrophe on their hands, which could not be called the fault of Gorbachev's administration. He inherited a, incredibly poorly designed and run nuclear power plant, several of them, and one of them just sort of instantly dissolved. But they were not transparent about it. They tried to cover it up like they always did. To Gorbachev's credit, he did, once he found out about it, instantly mobilize all the forces that were required to contain what was happening at Chernobyl. But, it was one of those things that, in terms of modern communications technology and scientific knowledge, I mean, all over Europe, people were like, there's a big nuclear fiasco happening here, according to, our sensors, our maps, our, technology. And communication being what it was, I mean, you couldn't have this complete blockade of outside information or something in the Soviet. So people were like, what's happening down there, Mikhail? This was inevitably going to come out, etc., right? And so this thought that, this person who had promised trustworthiness and openness was not being true to their word. So several things combine, right? And I will say significantly that another thing that combines with this is the fact that the West, seeing this destabilization, and when I say the West, I don't just mean the American government, I mean all of Western capital, starts pushing hard for the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for a reason that we can probably already identify, right? What is capitalism always looking for?
Markets and resources, and
Ooh.
also workers.
Yeah. New markets, right? New sources of raw material. Russia's a big place. Right? Gorbachev is pushed out. The Soviet Union collapses. Now, in his place is put into power Yeltsin. There is nothing good to say about him. That guy. The people of Russia elect, in their freest election probably ever, a bunch of representatives to the Duma. They, in polls and based on what these elected representatives were running on their platforms, what the former Soviet people kind of wanted was what we might think of like social democracy, right? They did not want an end to government, healthcare and education programs and so forth. And in fact, they were very skeptical after looking at what happened in Poland in 1989, where Poland just overnight liberalized, and foreign capital came in and bought everything in the country, and it was calamitous for average Polish citizens. Having seen that, the people of the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, people in Russia were like, we don't want that. Tough nuggets. By 1993, Yeltsin, who was, first of all, a raging alcoholic, he actually survived a coup attempt once by being too drunk to get on the plane.
Nice.
Saved himself accidentally.
So the coup tried to kill him on the plane, but he was too drunk.
No, they
to
were
stop
waiting
on
for where the plane was supposed to land. This is a real. But he was just they couldn't get him on the plane. And I mean, his people didn't know about this. This was, yeah. So by the time you get to 1993, you are in a situation where the relatively fairly, they were new to elections, but they did their best. Elected representatives of the Russian people were holed up in parliament, refusing Yeltsin's, what we would think of as like an executive order, liberalization plan, which was basically to just collapse all state services and put everything up for sale. Although Yeltsin did agree that he didn't want to see all of the, because remember, everything in Russia is theoretically owned by the people, which in practice means it's owned by the state, right? So they don't want to give this away to foreign capitalists, they give it away to homegrown Russian oligarchs, and that's where that starts up. But that's, again, not what the people want. They are holed up in parliament, the electricity and the water have been shut off. Yeltsin is trying to starve them out. People are in the streets, protesting, smuggling them food and water, trying to hold on to the parliament to prevent him from forcing this Western overnight liberalization plan on the country, and he orders tanks into the streets and fires on the parliament. I mean, this is literally as if Joe Biden called in the military, rolled a bunch of tanks down to Congress, and opened fire on the building where the Congress was holed up. I mean, that's the equivalent. Well, what can you do? Liberalization and capitalization and so forth proceeds. It is a calamity for Russia. Theoretically, shares of ownership in what had been government, in what had been sort of government-owned operations, are passed out to people, but the ruble collapses, and people now are in the position where they literally can't feed their families, so forth. So if you have dollars, quite literally American dollars, you swoop in there, you buy up all these shares, right? And desperate people are like, okay, fine, my kids are hungry. The government just gives out what had been these publicly, and of course we know about the corruption of the Soviet states, so publicly owned, but nevertheless, publicly owned operations. And remember, thinking about, to this day, the oil and gas industry in the Soviet Union, to friends and cronies and so forth. People wake up billionaires, like literally, you wake up in the morning and now you have $1 billion with a B dollars, because this large state industry now belongs to you personally, etc., etc. There is no more state healthcare, there is no more state education, there is no more state support for the arts. The marketplace in terms of culture is flooded with Western paraphernalia. Has anybody ever in their lives seen the Mikhail Gorbachev Pizza Hut commercial?
What?
Oh my God, Google it.
Wait,
I would Google it. I would Google it right now, except I've deployed my.
Sure, I guess I can do it.
It's amazing, just as a testament to the moment in history. I was a kid. I was 10, 11, 12 when this happened, but I remember all this. So, there was an AIDS epidemic in Russia. There was a tuberculosis epidemic in Russia. The rates of divorce skyrocketed. The rates of alcoholism and drug abuse skyrocketed. The rates of abortions skyrocketed. Women did not want to bring children into this situation. The average life expectancy of a Russian man between 1992 and 1999 fell 7 years. If anybody is familiar with the sort of statistics we're talking about there, that is incredible. Right? This was a disaster. Some people got very, very rich though. In 1999, former KGB man Vladimir Putin comes to power with the promise that he could fix this. History must report that in many ways he did. He is still many sections of the Russian populace, very popular for this reason. But coming out of all of this, and to get us around to Fedorchenko's, film, Putin's government encourages, let us say, nostalgia for the Russian past. And if you think back to the Jerevich article, right? If you think back to, if we didn't have Yuri Gagarin, we couldn't look each other in the eyes. Again, I've asked you to do this before, to imagine that you wake up on Christmas morning and Joe Biden is on the TV and says, the United States don't exist anymore. Where do you go? Just as a society, as a people, even as an individual, with that. And in the midst of all of these past several years of realizations about all of the horrible crimes your state committed, right? I'm not much of a person to talk about patriotism per se, but I mean, in terms of just the identity of a people, right? This is sort of an existential crisis in a way. And Putin and his government, and remember by this time we're talking about the early 2000s, so to this day, you were talking about people, if they were born when I was even, who have no memories really to speak of before Glasnost, certainly don't recall Stalinism, right? The revolution against the Tsars is a distant, just something you may or may not have really read much about in a history book, right? And so the atrocities of those eras are not so resonant with you, but you sure as hell remember the 1990s, right? And so you can start to get, and with Putin's administration's encouragement, a great deal of nostalgia for the Soviet Union in general, even for Stalinism, even for the era of Stalin. We won the war, right? Never were we more ferocious as a nation than under Stalin, right? When we destroyed Hitler, when we stood up to the American enemy, the America who came in and did this to us recently, right? Putin brought back the double-headed eagle. He was like, oh, we can take pride even in the imperial czarist state, the accomplishments of the Russian people, cultural and otherwise. And I mean, what's tragic about all of this is that, upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, what people really did want was democracy and freedom, from censorship and oppression, and a real representative government. But they also wanted, health systems and cultural systems and education systems that were for the people, that were egalitarian, that weren't controlled by if you were in the party and did you know this person, but also weren't controlled by well, if you're poor or tough, you don't get teeth, right? I mean, that didn't happen for one single day in Russia. So this is the sort of historical background to Fedorchenko's film, First on the Moon. So do we have any questions about this historical context? Okay. Do we have that? Did you find the commercial?
Yes, I did.
Hang on, I should have a book where you find my. Where are you?
That little duck over there is adorable. Because I've been staring at the one on your chest, but then the one there.
If you don't mind, I'm going
Don't mind at all?
book this into our media. Can.
days. Nice.
Where are you? Shades. Oh, they actually have a hookup in here. If you don't have a USB cable out there, you wouldn't mind. Serious with this?
Nice.
Oh my god.
It's compact.
Fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know this was a thing.
No, I didn't either. They don't have an HDMI port up here.
Interesting.
Because I don't have it, nobody has an adapter for this.
Oh, is that like a VCD or something?
From like 20 years ago.
Yeah, apparently they used to lock up this equipment, but then it became so old and worthless that they just
Yeah, they were just like, never mind.
Yeah.
I do, wait.
Is it there?
Yes.
Nice.
What the hell kind of egg is that? I feel it see right now.
Is this commercial on the level of that Quiznos commercial with the sponge monkeys? It should be.
What the hell is this? I feel truly insane right now.
Honestly. Oh man, I feel that every day. Like I lose some random thing that I need at that moment. I'm just like,
Okay, wait, now there's a third.
oh.
Oh my gosh. This is even more exciting.
There's a third adapter.
But
This is
I'm not even understanding how the white and the black cord are going together.
This is why.
Wow, that was a lot. Did my computer fall asleep?
We're a Windows only institution here.
Input 3. Let's see,
This is special.
this is amazing.
Maybe you have to check the left.
At least we'll know for next time, I guess.
Yeah, input 3, I don't have it on input 3. I have turned it on to HDMI 1 according to your little.
Then I guess you need to put it to 3 because maybe this projector.
There is no 3.
Oh.
Nice.
I give up.
Someone called the
Oh.
okay welcome to
I give up. I'm sorry. Incredible. Truly incredible. Where is a group of Pathfinders when you need to show the aspiring student body?
Probably up in the towers.
It looks like Hogwarts.
Yeah.
Anyway, never mind. Google it yourselves.
I can show it from like here. Are you sure?
Never mind.
Okay.
That was great. That was a great time we all just had just now.
I mean, people can hear the audio.
I want you to know that Pitt used to loan these out to instructors that have like Apple products, and then they just were like, "No, buy your own."
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So I did, and today it was useless to me. Great.
It'd be useful one day.
Someday.
Yeah. Just gotta keep hoping.
Anyway, never mind. Let's get back to Fedorchenko, shall we? So, to start with this though, I want us to think about documentary. I have noticed noticed on a number of occasions in the past couple of weeks when we've been talking about, cultural memory and the Soviet meddling with the recording of history and so forth and so on, people have offered up, and this is completely legit, I mean, don't get me wrong, people have offered up as a kind of, not exactly solution, but sort of like this question of like, how would you actually retrieve the truth of the past? And, we kind of come down to classic, sort of what we think of as like the materials of the historian, right? So if there's pictures that haven't been doctored, film that hasn't been doctored, documents, right, et cetera, and in fact, historians of the Soviet Union have made a lot of hash of the documents kept, right, by the totalitarian government, et cetera. I'd like us to think about the form of the documentary, particularly the documentary film. And for this, you can rely just on your own experience. So I'm asking you, when you think about a documentary film, what are the components of the genre, let us say? What are some of the things that if you're watching a film, you recognize it as being like, documentary?
Old people sitting there and like talking, and you don't know what they're saying, but they're saying something smart.
Right, so the expert interview, right? And you get the old person there, and at the bottom of the screen is their like name and qualification, and this kind of interview with the experts. Yes, this is a classic type of scene for documentary genre.
Historical footage, like black and white, which was seen in this
Yes.
documentary.
So some historical footage, as you said, often black and white, though, can also be that kind of grainy 70s color and so forth, right? Again, presumably undoctored. But, right, or if it's, if it's even before film, a bunch of black and white photographs.
What about a reenactment?
That's another one, right? We get actors to reenact. Again, especially if there's no film or photographic footage. Actors reenact the events as we have them recorded in documents.
Also a type of reenactment, like those 3D animations that kind of construct either places or objects from things.
Yeah, like diagrams and so forth. Now they're always animated. It's always like 3D animation.
Yeah.
In the past, it might have been sort of more 2D animated, or even just sort of the showing you of charts or tables, graphs, etc. Stephen.
People talking in ways that like people don't actually talk, like kind of a nature channel kind of way where it's like their inflections all weird and they like commentate.
The narration, right? We have come to expect a kind of like NPR voice narration, right? I don't quite know, as you say, it's sort of like different rhythm and cadence of regular speech. I don't really know how better to describe it than like, documentary voice, NPR, and if you listen to NPR in the car or something, this very sort of, I'm Sabrina Spire, and this is NPR, right? This kind of particular.
You should apply.
I do a lot of public speaking.
A lot of times it's like they try to make it as streamlined as possible, so like they usually go like with that NPR voice in like chronological order, like go through things slowly, so that like the viewer can actually understand like the history that's being told of them.
Yeah, there is this real attempt to fashion a narrative, right? Now, we've talked about this too, the idea that in our personal lives, the human brain seems to just flat reject the idea that the things that happen to us are just a random series of events, right? The idea, oh, maybe there's cause and effect, for sure, we live in a world of cause and effect. But the idea that, even so, it's just think, and then we die. This is just, humans just don't do that. I don't do it, no one does this, right? The human brain seems to have evolved, almost, to want to craft this series of events of our lives into a kind of narrative, right? So that we see ourselves as making progress to some kind of, endpoint through our lives. That makes sense, right? We also want to do this with everything, right? It seems to just be, I am not some sort of cognitive behaviorist, but my experience in the world, not just of individuals, but also of literature and science and just everything, right? As an academic, just as a person in the world, is that we always want to do this, right? We want a series of events to be instead, or in fact, a narrative. This leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, leads to this particular ending. Which is a way to feel like we are in some, not necessarily control, but that at least through our understanding, we are capable of grasping a situation from the past and perhaps assimilating lessons from it and applying those usefully in the future. Now, I'm not saying you can't do this. My point is not to disprove that, but to say that that's really, we're hung up on it. But if you've ever spoken with a historian, if you know anybody who's like a history student, or if you happen to know anybody who works, in these it's real messy, right? If you have read some less for the popular reader history books at any time, where they're really like, we're going to go through the evidence first and then try to draw a conclusion. Because of time, because of lost information, because of changes in human perspective that do not quite allow us access to the way people thought about things in the past, because of the destruction not just of historical records but historical sites, right, etc., you tend to, and this gets more and more true the farther back in time you go, actually get extremely fragmentary evidence that points for almost any subject you care to name. And it gets harder and harder to draw conclusions from this because the incomplete record does actually point in several different directions. Some of them are mutually exclusive, right? Now, again, my point is not that a trained professional can't draw a good conclusion from all of this, or maybe several good conclusions, but to say that it's messy, right? Science is messy. History is messy, right? But it's very difficult to communicate to a layperson all of the messiness in a certain subject field. This is something even I experience up here, right? I have a much broader knowledge of Russian history than the things that I am presenting to you. But for the sake of clarity and time, right, I just have to cut some of that out. Right? Because this is not a room full of specialists, nor do any of you, well, maybe one or two of you, but as far as I know, nor do any of you hope to someday be a professional Slavist, right? So it's not, although if you do, there's 10 job openings in the entire country right now, good luck. Not kidding. So, right. So you can see that when we talk about a documentary, especially a documentary that is for popular consumption, what are some of the problems that we're running into already with this? Just with this the facts of trying to craft a history. Necessarily, what are some of our problems in terms of the genre of documentary? Even a documentary created with the best of all intentions.
I think
So for one thing, we know that human memory is unreliable. So, if the physical evidence is probably spotty, the human remembered evidence is probably spotty too. And yet, and this again, just human nature, if you are asked to talk about something that you think you know about, you will necessarily just talk about it with great authority, won't you? Right? I say this to everybody, and myself included. You know, there's just this tendency to be like, ah, yes, and particularly if the subject is ourselves, right? Or something that happened to us directly. We're all the expert on ourselves, right? And so, if us as an expert on a topic or us as an eyewitness to an event is sat down to be interviewed, we will present ourselves as though we are the experts on that subject. Now, if a viewer of this sees just that, there is a completely justified tendency to be like, oh, okay, yeah, that happened. That's how it happened. Oh, okay. Right? We can all intuit the problems here, right?
Yeah, I was going to say in general how documentaries, even like the nature of like making a documentary and stuff, it's to make a narrative. Like it is, you know, a film form. And so, you know, you are doing an argument in one way or another. You know, even if you want to go as, you know, factually as possible, by making a documentary, you're making, you know, an argument that, oh, things were this way, or oh, you should feel about this. Especially if you want it to be an engaging documentary, you have to get people to feel about things. You have to get emotional stakes. You have to sway people to a side of rooting for something or rooting against something, even in very subtle ways, you know. Like if you're talking about, I don't know, the flag that was on the towers when it went down, you know, you start caring about that flag, and then what implications does that have? Does that have caring about patriotism, caring about the country, caring about infrastructure, towers? I don't know. So you, by making a thing, you're teaching, but you're also swaying people to a specific way of your teaching.
Yes. I mean, one thing about documentary narrative is that almost always, because either the ideology of the documentary maker, which I'm not necessarily saying is bad, we all have ideology, right? It's not my point exactly, but it depends on whether you're open about it, right? Like, if you just come into something and you're like, blah, 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 a love letter to communism, right?
Well, there we go. That's
Yeah, I mean, but no, the viewer is prepared, right? The viewer's like, oh, that's what this is, right? If you don't do that, if you don't even know you're doing it, right? Let me get into a fuzzier area. And as you said, almost all documentaries are making an argument, not just presenting a fact, not just presenting even just a narrative, right? And then some of this, particularly in Western documentaries, is going to have to do with the fact that, remember, we've talked about this, every piece of media made is also a commodity. Now that doesn't mean that the people making it are bad or shallow or didn't do their best or aren't creative and aren't artistic or aren't blah, that's not my point. But the fact of the matter is, if you want eyes on your documentary, it's got to make it into that like Netflix top 10. And if you, that's just it, that's just period. And so to do that, you have to not just make it accurate, you have to make it compelling, which involves things like making not just declarative statements about facts, but making a narrative, making an argument for or against, getting emotional stakes, making you identify with this or that player in the documentary, etc. All the things that one does to make art compelling. Because fundamentally, the documentary, at this point, one, is a kind of art. You know, we are talking about this and we can instantly, all of us, recognize, like, the tropes of the genre, right? Like, this is not a peer-reviewed scientific paper delivered in video form, right? It is a genre of art. even if it's technically non-fictional art. And it is also a commodity. And I said, this doesn't mean that you're a huckster necessarily or something, although you could be. Some people are. But it also means that if you think what you've made the documentary about is important, is vital, people need to know about it, like I said, only one way to get eyes on that, right, is to have it be big in the market. How do we do that sort of thing? Well,
I think that like particularly combines what you were saying before, that history is messy, because if you like think about it in isolation, that Lenin was impacted by like the German Marx who ended up living in England, like that sounds weird. And that is always happening, that there's like such connections that you wouldn't typically see. So it's hard to know if like the documentary is pure and it just oversimplifies, or if it is a case of them trying to be like malicious and deceive.
well, right, I mean, this is the thing. If you really pursue an element of history, speaking of Marx, I can tell you, you'll wander all over the place. When I started reading actual Marx, like Capital, etc., years ago, I found out that I needed to read some English history if I really wanted to. So then I go down this hole of the Industrial Revolution. But actually that has to do with land title rights and holdings in medieval England. So now we're down that hole. But when Marx talks about the dialectic, he's really drawing off of his history, philosophical history in Germany as a young Hegelian. So now we're in Hegel. Right? I mean, you can't put this all in a documentary. I couldn't even put it all in a class, right? People specialize their whole lives in things like this, right? And Hegel is impossible to read. Right, it just, and I said, we're talking about this right now as though, you know, we're talking about somebody who has good intentions in making their documentary. Not everybody does, right? Some people can recognize the fact that this is an easily manipulable art form that nevertheless people tend to assume is a reliable one, right? We are trained from years of, you know, the American experience on PBS, right? To assume that people at least have good intentions when they make documentaries, right? It makes it much easier if you don't, right? Because this is an easily manipulable thing. And even beyond this, behind intentional manipulation, we still have the fact that, as we have discussed, hegemonic ideas, you know, if you think back to the concept of Orientalism, you know, this idea that, oh, this is what the East is like. The Orient, the exotic Orient, right? But people don't even know, right? They don't know they have been subsumed into a hegemonic idea that they are recreating in their art, in their scholarship, that is false, because it's that pervasive and you're that indoctrinated. So again, there's that to think about, right? When the documentary maker goes to, right, there's all of this. One takeaway is to be critical, a critical viewer, critically minded viewer, right? When you watch a documentary. Which I will also point out though that I could love a documentary. That is like soothing to me. Go home, put on some Netflix shit about whales. Oh, so good. Just watching them fish. I even like corny shit like The Civil War by Ken Burns. Even though that's a mess, right? Got Shelby Foote up there like, well, the thing was, this particular slave owner was just a genius. Oh, was he, Shelby? Cool. Nathan Bedford Forrest. even given that, I'm just all like, that Civil War music comes up, like in the black and white photos. I'm like, they never made it out. Be aware though, right? Be aware as you watch. So okay, we have established that the documentary presenting itself as factual truth is in fact a genre of art with recognizable tropes of the genre, things that one constructs a documentary out of, recognizable forms and features that place it into the genre, and things that are necessarily manipulable of the truth, even with good intentions, and things that with bad intentions can be incredibly manipulated, right? So, okay. Now, tell me what a mockumentary is. What is a mockumentary as a genre? What is this? Okay.
It's like a satirical retelling of the book that kind of has an underlying satire, kind of funny almost.
It's like a satirical documentary, basically. It satirizes usually the thing that it, if you've ever seen like Best in Show or something. Am I making references people are familiar with? Best in Show is a pretend documentary about, it's funny, about a dog show.
Aw.
Right. It's a cute film. And I'm sorry, remind me.
Yeah.
So usually it is satirical of the subject matter. So in this case, imagine a satire about a dog show and the kind of people that put their precious little fluffy kittens into dog shows and things, right? You can kind of imagine, when they do interviews with the supposed dog, and they're actors, right? It's not real. It's made up. It's not a real dog show. It's people are Eugene Levy is in it, Canadian treasure, etc. Right? It's satirical of the subject that it is documenting, but it is also generally satirical of the documentary genre, right? Because with this very wink wink nudge nudge, we're recreating this interview and behind the scenes footage and documentation, etc. Right? Are there any more contemporary mockumentaries that somebody is familiar with?
Does The Office count technically?
Yes.
Yeah, The Office would count as a mockument, right? They're supposedly behind the scenes and they do the interviews, and they're supposed to be in objective observers somewhere. There's a camera crew, and then Jim looks at the camera, wink wink nudge nudge, right, etc. Right? And the thing about a mockumentary is that it's meant to be recognizable as satire, right? There is no point in watching The Office that you mistake it for a real documentary, right? There's no point in Best in Show, which again, I'm still recommending to you, even though I'm old and it's old and I know. At which you think this is a real documentary, right? Because it's a much more benign kind of absurdity than the kind Pelevin is practicing, right? Everything's turned up a little too high to be real, right? As a way to in this case, not necessarily criticize, but to kind of have some good-natured fun with, particularly subjects where people maybe are taking themselves a little too seriously, like perhaps at a dog show, right? Okay. This gets us around to Pervina Luna. Is Pervina Luna a mockumentary?
I guess. I'm being honest. I watched it. I tried providing it my full attention, but I got that was basically in the documentary style. I think I got that there was a group of kids trying to make a rocket and that it ultimately failed. Other than that?
Well, that was, in the documentary style, they are talking about how back in the 30s, the Soviet Union assembled this rocket.
Oh, so this wasn't like a group of college kids, this was the entire Soviet Union producing?
Well, right, in what they're actually documenting. And then those modern scenes were contemporary supposed scientists and engineers going off those documents and trying to make a working model. Right? And that kind of, we've seen this in documentary before, like, would it fly? Let's find out with modern experts.
Oh yeah, the Mythbusters do that.
Yeah,
a
like
lot.
that kind of thing, right? So that's what those
Okay,
scenes are.
so it was going over the old things, and then this group was trying
Yes,
to make.
and
them-
theirs blew up on the pad.
Yes.
I couldn't tell if it was a mockumentary or not, but for some reason it reminded me of like those Nazi documentaries where they're like filming the women like exercising or something, and they're like, look at these women, you
Yeah,
know,
propaganda film. This
that
is
type of thing. And then it like, and when I was like listening to Sean, I was like, oh, so it's like one of those like films about like the Nazis during World War II and their lives, and it's so there's like cutting to like a historian in like current times, and then there's like a film reference of
Yeah.
like, I don't know, kids walking down the street in like fast.
Young Pioneers.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the documentary purports to show, you know, archival footage of Soviet propaganda. And so some of the archival, in quotations, footage in Pervina Luna are these recreated, but extremely accurate recreations of this kind of Soviet propaganda film. So you see like young pioneers parading down the streets, and you know, the kind of, you know, they're testing out centripetal force on a pig to see if they can send a monkey into space. I mean, we did send a dog into space, right? That sort of thing. And again, it's presented as pulled straight out of this kind of Soviet archival footage. And if you've ever seen actual Soviet archival propaganda footage, it's 1-to-1, man. They match that shit up. Things like where they're showing, you know, the guy beating out, you know, 1,000-pound bolts, right? And they're talking about the Stakhanovites. The Stakhanovite was a real movement. This guy, Stakhan, he tripled his quota in the steel factory. And the government picked up on this. This was a real thing, he really did it. And the government picks up on this and says, we should all be Stakhan, we should all be Stakhanovites. And starts this sort of national propaganda campaign to get everybody to triple their quota for the motherland, right? And so we see that, and then of course that's contrasted with, you know, the modern engineer sitting in front of a computer where that's like plink, 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 which, you know, makes the contemporary Russian look pathetic, but the old school Soviet look like a mountain of a man in contrast, right? So yeah, so all of these are following these documentary tropes, but I'll tell you what, this film, the year it was released, won Best Foreign Documentary in an Italian film festival. No sense whatsoever that it was satire. Fedorchenko, in an interview, said that it was 98% serious. So, although we are familiar with the concept of a mockumentary, which you could call a fake documentary, but is clearly meant to be satire, it fakes the genre tropes of a documentary for the point of, you know, to the end of satirical humor. First on the Moon fakes the documentary tropes, right? The tropes of the documentary genre. But is it satirical? Is it funny? Did you find it satirical? Did you find it funny?
I found
I thought it was
mostly
funny.
confusing.
That pig man.
I just thought it was stupid the whole time.
I mean, you might be like, this film sucks, LOL. But I mean, do you think they were trying to be funny, I guess?
No.
Right. That's just a fake documentary. People loved it. When it came out in Russia, the posters, giant picture, moon, you know, like big, the prints up here, and there's the moon and the moon lander. We were there first. That's how it was advertised. So just, you know, briefly to get this set. What does this fake documentary purport to document? What is it purporting to document?
Maybe like the Soviet culture and how
But no, much more straightforward than that. What is the claim of the documentary?
the claim. Oh, it claims journey to the moon.
The Soviets got to the moon. Right? This is, we interview one of the surviving cosmonauts. We see archival footage of, back in the 30s in their youth, the other cosmonauts and him being selected, going through their training. We see supposedly archival footage of them being watched by the NKVD, right, being spied upon. We see supposed plans for the rocket that was built. We supposedly see footage of the rocket being built. Right? I mean, this makes up the claim, and then so you get the, as I said, you get the contemporary engineers, and they're sort of like, well, these are the plans. Let's see, will it fly? And they sort of build their fake, their little or not fake, but their little model, right? And we're told that the rocket blasted off, but then disappeared. Sort of they lost track of it. One cosmonaut is lost on the rocket. He's lost. Another escapes. The rest are killed by the NKVD because this was a failed project. All of this is taking place in 1937 and 1938, which is the height of Stalin's terror. It's literally called the terror. But what we find out is the lunar lander crashed back to Earth. The lead cosmonaut is brain damaged, right? But he makes his way from Chile all the way back to Russia. He can't really communicate with people what has happened to him. We have interviews with people who, he ends up in a mental assignment. We have interviews with people who knew him there and passed some letters for him and helped him get out, blah, blah. The documentarians lose track of his life story after he joins a circus, unable to speak anymore because of his injuries. But the last thing the film shows, even though the model made by the contemporary engineers blows up in the pad because they're not up to the task, the last thing the film shows is footage of that lander on the moon. He went to the moon. He came back. First on the moon. Right? The central claim of this fake documentary is that in 1938, Stalin's government put a man on the moon. What do you make of this? And truly, what do you... I mean, because we've seen something sort of like this in Oman Ra. He makes all kinds of wild claims about the Soviet space program. But we know they're absurd, we know they're satirical, we know they're not true, and he has used them to make his critical point about the Soviet Union, right? We've talked about what Palet's been doing.
Well, I'm confused. Is he the guy who's like being interviewed and then making like those motor insects?
No, that's one of the cosmonauts that escaped being murdered after the program failed.
Oh.
That's the life that he has made for himself.
Okay.
The other guy was a Hamerdadov or something. Harlamov. He's the one that eventually, he's been to the moon and back, but he can no longer speak. He's been injured, so he can't report on this. And eventually joins the circus.
This almost seems like what I thought Oman Ra was before you explained that he wasn't actually on the moon. That was all just like a set. When I was very confused, because it almost seems, pretty pessimistic in how, or realistic, whichever way you want to put it, with how the Soviets would deal with that, like with, murdering the people who knew about the project. One person left, like incredibly disabled, things like that. But, they were able to do it. And that's like the fantastical portion of it, that they were able to do it. and then almost everything around there.
There's something not dissimilar about Pelevin's techniques and Fedorchenko, insofar as both take as a jumping off point the real space program of the Soviet Union. Both make false claims about its relative capacity or incapacity. They present those things as truth, and those are the conceits of both films. But as we saw for Pelevin, the absurdity of things like, cutting off their legs to dance the kalinka and so forth, makes it obvious, as is usually the case in a mockumentary, makes it obvious that this is satirical, right? The absurdity is turned up to such a degree that you cannot miss the fact that it's not actually true. That is, in fact, satire. And in Pelevin's case, it's a satire that is directed at criticizing, now that he finally can, the Soviet Union in all the ways that we talked about it, right? First on the Moon is also starting with the facts of, Soviet space program, kind of rocket technology, etc., placing it a little early than it really began. Because it's really, the Soviet space program is sort of like the American space program. It's based off of post-World War II technology, right? But whatever. And then making this false claim, in this case, about the superior capacity, not the inferior capacity, of the Soviet Union space program. It's not clear to me that at any point it's absurd enough to really reveal itself as satire. What do you think? What do you think? There's no wrong answer to this question. Did you get the sense in watching this that it was meant to be absurd, or that it was meant to be satirical, or that it was meant to be critical of the Soviet Union? I see you, but I'm hoping. I said no wrong answer here. I'm just, polling the room here.
You could do like a raising of hands, one for yes, one for no.
Trying to make them participate. Okay, so, all right, let's do this. Show of hands.
So wait, what's your question?
Right.
Did you see?
So, if in watching this film, did you see it, as with Oman Ra, as being absurd, to make it noticeably satirical, to make it noticeably critical of the Soviet Union? Hand up for yes. Okay. Now, that's completely, the NKVD follows people around and then murders them when they fail to get to space. For sure. Right? What about no?
What? Thought they were not trying to.
Guys, someday I'm just gonna lose my shit in here. Thank you. Did you watch it where you're just sort of like, okay, did the Soviet Union get to the moon or something?
I thought it was comedy.
It's hard for me to answer because I feel like it's kind of intentionally hitting that ambiguous middle ground. The one thing for me that makes it feel like satire is like you say, the creations of the propaganda and stuff. It's like almost like so on the nose that it feels like a satire. But aside from that, it's just so dry. I feel like it doesn't really have a suggestion.
It's got a real straight face to it, let's say. And Fedorchenko says as much. Oh no, my battery is running low. That's okay, we're almost done. It's got a real straight face to it. Fedorchenko admits as much when he talks about the film. And I can tell you that many people in Russia received it as a kind of nostalgia. Not that people in Russia believed that they actually got to the moon in 1938, but they liked imagining that they did, right? It's like a little wish fulfillment journey, in a way. Now, go ahead. In inserting a cultural memory. Yeah, I like this. Remind me. Yeah, this idea of rewriting history to make it something somehow nicer. Right? Like, okay, the propaganda is still there, and the NKVD is still there, and the violence is still there, but it all goes to this end, much nicer than any end that actually occurred in 1938. And in this sense, and I mean, it's not that Fedorchenko can't put, it's not like the government falsifying history. Fedorchenko just made a film for the market. People liked it, or not, whatever, right? He can't falsify history the way the government could. But it seems like an act almost of nostalgia, or reparation of the past, right? The idea that you could for a moment lose yourself in the idea that the Soviet Union went to the moon in 1938, we were there first. Now, nostalgia is very much something that Western theorists have talked about in terms of postmodernism. Because we already know that history starts to collapse. Past forms enter the present as commodities. And part of what makes those past forms salable as commodities is nostalgia. Nostalgia being that longing for the past that never was, right? And you can actually track this, especially at Christmas time. Man, the entire time I was a kid, everything at Christmas was for boomers, was for people my parents' age. I'm dead serious. The movies they showed on TV and the music they played on the radio and all kinds of things, right? Now that we millennials are the main buying power in America, such as it is, Christmas is Die Hard and Mariah Carey, baby. That's what sells to us, right? Speaking of documentaries, I've been watching documentaries on Netflix recently. The Toys That Made Us, they're all shit from the 80s. I watched the My Little Pony feature. Or the Movies That Made Us, again, it's all shit from the 80s. One of them was Die Hard. This is nostalgia aimed at my target market demographic. That's what it is. So nostalgia exists for a market reason. Nostalgia also exists for an ideological and a political reason. How often have you heard a politician in America, and I promise you this is what Putin does in Russia, talking about, we're gonna make America great again. And I mean, I know Trump, blah, 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 but I mean, before Trump, many people other than Trump, many people still to this day, they don't actually say MAGA now because that's signifying something else. But the general idea of, right, take America back, take Russia back, make Russia great again, whatever, right? I mean, like, what are we trying to get back to? Like, are we trying to go back before Brown v. Board of Education? What are we trying to do with this, Grandma? Right? But nostalgia is not about real things. Nostalgia is about the idealized past and bringing it into the present to assuage our needs, be they commercial, political, ideological, etc., right? In that sense, Fedorchenko in the early 2000s, in a world that is finally being rebuilt by shirtless Volodya there, on his horse, and you know, it's easy to make fun of him, and Putin's a serious man. Nostalgia, you know, coming off the 90s and all that was destroyed, looking back. And it fascinates me because we spent like hours and hours and hours in here talking about how one of the sins of the Soviet Union was this destruction of the past, the destruction of the truth, to the point where if you were trying to fight that, you also had to falsify language, right? The utopian mode. And then I had pointed out to you that, you know, Pelevin in this moment when he's free to tell the truth for the first time, he goes right back into these language games. And, 15 years on, Fedorchenko is like, I faked a documentary. Now you would think if you had gone through what the Russian people went through in terms of fake documentaries, right? No. Thoughts on this?
I think again it's with the nostalgia and with the familiarity. It feels familiar, it feels nice, it feels good, especially if you're making something for the masses. They might be like, oh man, this seems almost a little bit like this documentary when I was little, which was a falsified documentary. It might give sense of warm feelings and, just kind of a nice little story of them going to the moon. And, they're kind of used to the whole themes of people being killed for different things,
It's fascinating to think about the longings that truth cannot fulfill, and the ways in which postmodernity as a cultural aesthetic and media style facilitates those longings at the expense of the truth. Well, in any case, start reading. I don't expect you to get very far in it. It's fine. But I would like you to start reading for Wednesday, Heart of a Dog, just to get a taste of it, like a taste of the book,
Was Journey to the Moon not the last thing in our...
No, it is. Journey to the Moon is the last thing in the unit.
This is for next unit.
Yes. But I'd like you to, so I said, get a taste of Heart of a Dog. You're going to finish reading it over Thanksgiving break so that we're ready to... But on Wednesday, I'm going to give some upfront information to save time, so that when we come back after Thanksgiving break, you've read Heart of a Dog, we're ready to go. Got it?
Also for the